Hello. All right. So, um, so I thought it might be valuable to do a video that discussing or bringing into question some beliefs and assumptions or misconceptions about non-duality, or whatever you want to call it. Whatever I talk about on this channel, awakening, non-duality, spirituality, it's sometimes called, meditation, so on. And then some of the potential dangers of that, of non-duality, and the message of non-duality, no self-awakening, and so on. And then my experience on it as well, because I know I've made the point on this channel of talking about this character's life, my life as a person in the so-called relative world, just to demonstrate that I have a life outside this. So as well as being a non-duality weirdo that sits and films videos in his car talking about nothing, I also have a life. I have a family, I have a job, I have responsibilities, I have relationships, friends, so on. And I bring that up to just highlight that what you see on this channel, and see other non-duality people who talk about non-duality, is but a fraction of their life. Is just a message, is just an isolated context. Let's say it could be taken as a context. So in this context, I'm talking apparently about something, I'm talking from something, but that doesn't need to be talked about or focused on in daily life. In fact, if anyone on this, I don't know if anyone does, knows me personally, then they'll know that in comparison to, if you were to make a contrast in comparison to the rest of life and the rest of this character's personality, this seems like a different context. This seems like out of context, out of character, because I'm not talking about the character, I'm talking about something else. And if it was to be contrasted to the normal behaviour of the character, it would seem different. And you could say the same for other non-duality speakers. So if there are seekers who are immersing themselves in the content of this, then it's useful to know that what you see people talk about is them talking about non-duality. That's not the whole picture. You know, and spending a lot of time with someone who has realised this, or recognised this, or has been through this, might paint a completely different picture. It might cut through some of the assumptions about what this means for the person when it happens. I mean, and there are downsides to this message as well. There's a lot that I can talk about it. Yeah, there's a lot I can talk about that maybe isn't commonly talked about in the circles of non-duality on YouTube or whatever. I mean, for example, can you imagine living with me? Can you imagine living with me, having normal neurotic patterns of worry and negative emotion? It might be more integrated now, but there was a period of time where it can't have been pleasant to live with someone. There's a period of time of detachment, there's a period of time of disassociation, there's a period of time of neurotic seeking, beliefs, new beliefs, so on and so on. And that whole journey across time isn't without its just spat on the camera, isn't without its difficulties. So it's important to realise that this message isn't a serious message. If it's taken seriously, if it's taken on seriously by a massive truck coming by. If it's taken on seriously by the the person, if it's taken on as a set of beliefs by the mind, by someone who is experiencing dysfunction, depression, so on and so on, it can easily turn into something extremely destructive in life if it becomes a belief. I mean, the non-dual radical message, I don't think I've said that before. I could be wrong. I don't think I've said there's no one here. There's no one here to feel those emotions. There's no one here to have those problems. Because I don't believe that. I could have said that because my earlier videos were filled with my own beliefs and delusions. But I don't believe that. I don't believe that there is no person. I don't believe there's no one here. I don't believe in spirituality. I don't believe in non-duality. I don't believe in liberation. I don't believe in meditation. The list goes on because it's not about beliefs. No matter how many times that's said, you could hear the message and then think, okay, right, I know what my beliefs are, but for me, for a long time, the beliefs were hidden. They were hidden beliefs. I wasn't aware of them consciously. And at times, when the beliefs dropped away, it wasn't even clear what the belief was. It was more of an energetic thing. So I've not talked about the whole relative journey. I've talked about, in one of my very early videos, I talked about I'd been familiar with the pattern of seeking. I think it's helpful to talk about this because it may be relatable, and there might be assumptions and beliefs about this person here when you watch this strange way of talking from some weirdo sitting in his car in the ghetto here. But there was the whole journey of seeking, and I think the seriousness of it is there because of the serious and heavy feel of suffering. And for me, it was very heavy, it was very serious, and there was a lot of suffering. There was a lot of extreme suffering. And that's what brought me to this. So, everyone's different. Everyone might approach what I'm talking about in a completely different way, and it might not be framed in a non-dual context. It might not be anything to do with spirituality or non-duality, because at the end of the day that's just a framing, that's just a means, a framework, a means of understanding that is maybe used by the person to direct attention to what I point to. That's just a framework, and the framework can be anything, the approach can be anything, and it might not look like a spiritual approach. So and it really doesn't matter. It doesn't matter. I ended up so I'll describe my own journey in a way that maybe I've not, in a relative way that I've not talked about before. So I describe that feeling of discontentment, unease, unhappiness, not rightness, because I know some people will relate to that, and I pointed to it in a number of videos, and sometimes when people hear that, when I heard that, it really just resonated with me. I like that word now, resonated with me, and on a level that I just felt, and it really felt like something that I was being drawn towards something anyway. That not rightness, that something's not right, that question that I later discovered it was the root of all suffering. That one existential fear, that one question, that one not rightness, uncertainty, that I remember pondering when I was a child, but it wasn't heavy then. As I got into my teenage years, it became heavy. The question of what the fuck is going on, what is this, what am I, who am I? Something's just not right about this, I can feel it. Why is no one talking about about this? And even when I looked into religion and so on, people were talking about the feeling of it was there, but they didn't seem to be talking about what I felt directly. But despite all this kind of angst, teenage angst, grew for a bit, and I had an awakening experience. I had a few of them actually, but there was one that I mentioned, I described in an earlier video, on a train, and there wasn't much of a context for that, or a way to interpret it at the time. I actually thought I maybe had a seizure or a stroke or something like that, and based on the memory of it, I could describe it as a non-dual experience, like an awakening experience that was seemingly triggered by, at that point in time, it was triggered by this feeling mixed with an anxiety about the physical environment. I'll not go into the specifics of it, but it was a clear non-dual experience. After that, that experience stuck with me in memory, and I had pursued the same thing because I recognised, I was like, that's the thing. I had experienced this before, and initially when I was much younger, with the super migraine I had, there was like a forced disassociation from the pain, and that was a trippy experience. And again, it was the same, I could try and describe it, but it was the same non-dual experience. And then I kind of ended up gravitating towards that, and I did that through the medium of sport, that eventually took on the form of extreme sport and extreme risk. Because in that flow state that I've talked about before, in that balance of concentration and surrender, that was that non-dual again. It was that stillness, that peace, that something that I was drawn towards. And I seek that in my own way. And then it became a passion of mine, the sport, it was parkour, free running at the time, like acrobatics type stuff. And this that drew me towards that, took me all over the UK, and outside the UK, and people that I met along that journey had the same thing. You could see it in them. I could recognise it in them. This thing, the thing that I couldn't describe. And I met one person who got it, and I could talk to him about it. And much later on down the line, it turns out that he's a very realised person, if you can say it that way. He'd been on the path, and had this recognition, had this clarity, had this realisation that I talk about. So after that experience, I ended up chasing it, but my mind framed it in a seeking way. It just became a seeking dysfunction, and over the next near decade, my life turned into, at points, a living hell, a nightmare. The suffering almost killed me, I think. It all came from that question. Well, I don't think, I know. I definitely almost died a few times. It all came from that question, that unease, that not rightness that had always kind of been there. But through the chasing of this experience, it reinforced the seeking function. It reinforced that there's something that I need to find, and it's not what I'm experiencing now. That experience led me to Buddhism, into like Hindu philosophy and so on, eventually to enlightenment. And then for a while I drove myself insane with this question, and the question led to an obsession about death. And I seemed to attract people into my life. I surrounded myself with people who I recognised this in whatever way. This, whatever that drive is, whatever that seeking is, whatever that discontentment is. And I happened to share with them this deep suffering. And that there was a kind of connection there. That led into drug and alcohol abuse. So I noticed I could get a relief in the same way that I did from the extreme sports, from drug and alcohol abuse, and that turned into a massive problem, and that's what led to the near death several times. The very last time I was in hospital for 2 weeks, and that was the one that almost killed me. But I was chasing something. I just deep down I knew I was chasing something. And for example, if I had got a hold of radical non-duality at any point during that, I can't say, this is just a complete fabricated speculation, but I don't think that would have been helpful to me, because for me, I felt like a person. I felt like a me with a problem, looking for a solution. That was my experience. That was real. Telling myself that, or listening to someone telling me that that's not real, is nonsense. So if you feel like a person, whatever you feel, if you have beliefs, if you have a felt belief about something, then that's real for you. That, you can't just tell yourself that's not real. Distance yourself from it, because that's avoidant, that's disassociation. You can't tell yourself that these emotions aren't real because there's no one here to experience them. That's bullshit. That's nonsense, because that's not your experience. That wasn't my experience. But for a while I got led down the path of sitting there many times sitting there completely out my face on whatever, or drunk, like trying to meditate, trying to not think, trying to look for a solution in the thoughts and the philosophy, and asking myself, what is going on here? What is this all about? Driving myself insane, massive amounts of suffering, depression, because it was so serious. It was also heavy. It was also, my problems are so important. If only the world knew about the importance of my very serious problems here, then they might understand. They might not be so alone in this. Like, typical teenage angst stuff at, mid-20s, in the mid-20s, which wasn't actually that long ago. But it was serious, it was a problem. And the seriousness of that suffering and that obsession and that problem manifested itself in the seriousness of this message of enlightenment, non-duality. Creating a solution, a very serious solution to a very serious problem. I could go into detail and stories about all the madness, all the insanity, some of which would be barely believable because it was completely mental. Like, the character that you see in these videos is like, if you were to compare that to the character at that point back then, and it would be, you wouldn't believe it. You wouldn't believe that that's the same person. So, so that took that played out over the course of about 9 years. This insanity, this self-destruction, this seriousness, this immense unhappiness and suffering. And eventually, the solution to that, if anyone doesn't know anything about addiction, substance abuse disorders, alcoholism, that was I grew up with two alcoholic parents in a very kind of depraved area of Glasgow. The alcoholism is the thing that killed my dad eventually. It's a frightening illness, one of the most notoriously difficult areas of psychopathology that you could look into. It's truly frightening, and to consider that, you have to also consider some really scary things about the nature of self and free will. That the pathology itself is by definition the absence of choice. The pathology apparently, conventionally, has the ability to remove the autonomy of the individual, the sufferer, or at least temporarily hijack the autonomy of the individual, take control. So in that, the problem, the whole pathology, is the absence of control. Apparently, the solution, the cure to that pathology, that illness, is the attainment of control. But the weird thing about it, right, is that the control is never consciously obtained. The agent never obtains control. It's a letting go, very similar to what I talk about in these videos. In fact, that's the beginnings of this awakening that I talk about. The letting go of control, the acceptance that there is no control, the stop trying to control, because the trying to control is futile. There was a there was a certain point. The 2 weeks in hospital was the point of where it all kind of tailed off, and then the people I was associated with, the people I was friends with, a lot of them started dying, unfortunately. So people were dropping dead, and it all became, the obsession with death took me too close to death for comfort, and the tragedy was something I wasn't even able to process at that time, something I wasn't even able to feel because I was so distanced from my emotions. People were dropping dead and I just didn't care. I didn't notice. Ignoring feelings, emotions, and so on. So there was another shift, and I would describe it as a distancing from the thoughts, a distancing from that apparent entity that exists with problems. It says, I need to do this to get something, I need to do this to make myself feel better, I need to take this action, have this behaviour, have this addiction, to get away from or find a solution to this question, this something in the back of my mind that was driving all this. That all happened after an awakening experience. The awakening experience seemed to be the catalyst to accelerate this suffering, because after that nothing was quite right, because without a context, without an object of pacification, like sports or drugs, this awakening experience happened out of context. So there was no way to frame that in a way that's when the feeling of being lost started to appear, because there were things to hold on to before, but now there was nothing to hold on to, because in a seeking sense there was no object. I was like, I'm seeking something, what happened? And then it all became much more painful after that, as I said, for about 9 years. Anyway, enough of the madness. So I got myself together in whatever way it came about. I got myself together. Life started to make a bit more sense again. I forgot about that, or at least I repressed that question. I just kept myself busy. There was a way to deal with or ignore that, all that had led to the question that had led to all this, and that was fairly successful for a while, although it was always still there, and it would pop up every now and again. And then much more recently, the meditation thing came back. So I noticed something. The only reason I noticed it is because I wasn't seeking it. I enjoyed walking. I was walking, and what I was doing, I was just enjoying the sensory experience of walking and treating it like a meditation. Not for a goal, not for seeking, but just for the simple enjoyment of walking, because I remembered that the simple enjoyment of running, sports, play, without a reason, that had been a passion of mine before that circuit became dysfunctional. And I wasn't seeking. There was a kind of interest in the Buddhist traditions and the awakening and stuff like that, and I did a wee bit of reading, but it wasn't heavy, it wasn't serious, because I felt at that point alright. I'd kind of ignored the question, the existential problem, to the extent where it had diminished, because I had new responsibilities, I had new things to do and focus on. It was almost like a surrender to the norm, surrender to the continual resistance and fight against this normal relative world that seemed so wrong to me. Suddenly there were things to appreciate, and it was simple things. Because there was no heaviness, because there was no seriousness there, because there was no need to attain something, then something in my experience became more pronounced. And this is what I've been trying to describe on this channel for such a long time now. Something, and I didn't know what it was, but it was obvious. It was clear, it was simple. Didn't need to be analysed. There was no conflict. There was no this or that. There was no relative and absolute. There was no all the polarities of non-dual concepts, all the beliefs that are polarized, that were masquerading themselves as non-duality, as spirituality, were just the same seeking, the same thing with a different object, with a different focus or framework. The need to find myself, or the need to resist my feelings or distance myself from my feelings or emotions or negative thoughts and stuff like that had just kind of diminished, and then something much more simple became obvious. And then that's when I started filming these videos after, and started writing these journals after the what I perceived as a shift, an awakening. But it was much more simple. It wasn't complicated. It wasn't this or that. It wasn't heavy. It wasn't serious. It was simple. It was, and I've been trying to point to that simplicity. I tried to point to that non-conceptuality, that feeling, the feeling of it, for a while, and it wasn't. There was an element of disassociation to it, or escapism to it, to that practice of walking and meditating, but it was enjoyable. It wasn't looking for something, trying to find something, trying to find a solution, trying to find an awakening, trying to wake up. It was just the simple enjoyment of being a person walking walking around and enjoying the senses. And then the trying to figure out, of course it continued for a while, but something was gone after that shift. Something was gone. The heaviness was gone. The belief that I had to find something. There was a me that had to find something that was very serious and had all these problems, and it was replaced with just what was here, what was simple, what didn't need belief. Didn't need belief at all. Didn't need thought to confirm. It was too simple, and there was an immense peace in that, an immense peace, release in that. And all of a sudden, things were less heavy. The struggle on a felt level had kind of dissolved. That we've seen that the struggle isn't here, but the emotions they had to be confronted, had to be felt, couldn't be distanced from, had to be moved through. There had to be a moving through energetically of all of this felt stuff that had accumulated, had built up as a story holding it all together. But I noticed that it appeared here and I could move through it. And when I moved through it without the story, or when it moved through me without the story, it wasn't as scary as the story said, as the beliefs said. The awakening, I remember in one of the earlier videos I said, is this it? Is this it? Because it seemed too simple. It didn't seem like this elusive thing in the future that I was going to attain, that was going to solve all my problems. I was like, oh, okay, I remember, this is it. It's so simple. It's so simple. And I think I'll make another video on talking about the experiences, because I've not done that, but I find it quite interesting, the experiences that come along with this, because there are many experiences that I've not talked about because they just didn't come up. But there were a lot of experiences that I found very enjoyable. There were a lot of experiences that I found quite frightening, but it was possible to feel that, to experience that now. Whereas this always moving, always chasing something, thought chasing itself around, experience chasing itself, it was all complicated, it was all scary, it was all a mess. But there was a massive relief in just simply being able to feel what is here as it comes up, and it wasn't so bad. It wasn't so bad at all. In fact, there was an immense peace in it, an immense love in it. I'll not describe the whole thing because I've talked about it enough on this channel, but the main point is it wasn't heavy. The emotions are emotions. Emotions have their heaviness, they have their nuance and their flavour and their tones to them. But there wasn't this big heavy narrative, this big heavy story of seeking that had kind of exhausted itself to a degree. It was simple, it was light, it was playful. It was like, I would describe it like art, like the whole world became art. Expressive form of art with nothing behind it, with no meaning behind it. It was the heavy meaning, the heavy need to find the meaning or purpose. There was just no purpose other than the display, the expression, and there was a simplicity and innocence in that was much more pronounced and experienced than this weird story I'd been telling myself about I need to find this or that. I need to find enlightenment and then all my problems will be solved. And then ensued a lot of moving through the emotions, moving through the energetics of this. And it took on a life of its own. It wasn't, the person could just relax. The person could just sit in the back seat and enjoy the ride, for example. Because something else was moving it, and it didn't need this massive effort and this massive control and resistance to just be what it is and move how it moves. Very simple. And it became easy to spot that when things were polarized, when things were this or that, when I was resisting myself, when there was a self in here resisting an idea of self that it thought was very important, that it thought it had to do, that it just had built up this habit of doing that because it thought it needed to do it, it became easier and easier to spot that. And every time that came up, a little bit of it dissolved, a little bit of it was let go of. The radical non-dual speakers, there's a, I can't speak for any of them or specific or whatever, but they're in that message, I think that message is missing a lot of the nuance and the emotion and if taken on by the mind, it could potentially invalidate a lot of what you feel. If you feel like a self that is struggling against the world, and that's your felt experience, that's real. It might be exposed as an illusion at some point, but if that's real, that's real. It's not just because it's an illusion. doesn't mean it's not real. And I think it can be, when it creates resistance, when there's say for example, if you feel an emotion or you react, when you feel like you need to do something about it, you feel like you need to frame it in some way, frame it as this isn't right, then that's just another form of resistance, that's just another form of suffering. The radical non-dual pointing was useful for me at a certain point post-awakening, because it pulled up a felt sense of a position, a subtle position, a felt sense of a framing, and that felt like fear, existential fear. The remnants, the flavour of that still were moving. Something was still holding, and listening to that brought up this felt sense. Like I said in the previous video, there was a resonance there that brought up this felt sense of a position, a subtle holding of a position that's trying to figure out the mystery of the universe, trying to figure out, if I'm infinite awareness, then, like, if it was to talk, it would say, if I'm infinite awareness, then I'm the only one in the universe. Like this kind of like nihilistic solipsism. It was helpful to bring that up and then just feel through it, just let it be exposed as just another position and then dissolve back into everything. That's what it was useful for. It never became for me a doctrine or a belief system, because I think that illusion was broken at that point. It wasn't enticing, and it wasn't in a real way to believe that I am not a me, I am not a self, because the felt sense of this was way overpowering that, but there were still subtle framings there, and I found it useful to bring them up in the moment and then go into them as much as possible, those feelings of existential terror. And they were brief, they came and went, but it wasn't a long narrative. It wasn't like 9 years of existential terror like it was before, because it couldn't be taken that way anymore. And the whole thing of spirituality is just maybe a collective or personal framework. This doesn't have to be spirituality, and if this might not be for everyone, likely if you're watching these videos, there is that question there. There is something pulling you towards this that I talk about. But this might not be the medium that's suitable, and it doesn't have to be a certain way. Ultimately, it just doesn't matter. It just doesn't matter. It mattered to me for a long time until it didn't. And it seems like the mattering played itself out in the way, with associated suffering in the way it did, perfectly. But ultimately, it just doesn't matter, and you don't need to wake up. I mean, I could just say that there's no awakening. There isn't an awakening. Like, there's an awakening on one level, and on another level there isn't. And that paradox, that duality, is the kind of line you walk at a certain point, and you can't talk about that. And it's either the mind gets hold of it, and it, the you frames itself with a concept, or it doesn't. there's no controlling that. It just happens automatically, which is why a form of speaking, a medium through which that you explore that about yourself is with which you find that resonance that feels right for you intuitively, instinctively, then that can be anything. It might not be these videos, it might be art or music or rally driving or if that makes sense. But I don't know what I'm talking about. When I can tell you stories and stuff like that about the experience of this character, but when I talk from this, I'm not someone who knows what he's talking about and trying to get a message across in a heavy way that it's all serious and you need to do this and that. It's just not like that. It's just not like that at all. That's why I like the word resonance. There's a resonance there, and that's why I always say when you know, so to speak, when you know what I'm talking about, when there's that instinctive, intuitive knowing, then that's this whole thing. So many words to just point to that, because you can have that feeling and you can have that story going along with it, but it seems at a certain point they just break off, and then this becomes more feeling, the intuitive sense, the felt sense becomes more obvious, and then it's just that, and you don't need this story, you don't need all that story. It might be both for a while, but once that's there and there's some clarity on that, then that's it. That's this whole thing. It's just that all the way. And the words, the story, the awakening, and so on isn't really relevant. The thoughts about it, the concepts about it, aren't really relevant. So the emotions, the feeling, the felt sense is go into that, confront the emotions, confront the felt sense of you in whatever form. Don't resist it, don't distance yourself, disassociate from it. Don't tell yourself a belief about what this means, or this isn't real, or I've done all that, it doesn't work. It doesn't. It's more simple than that. It's much more simple. And the emotions are emotions. Emotions are real. The thoughts are thoughts. The thoughts are real. And the experience of them right now, that's all real. It's not wrong. It's not anything. It's just what it is. It's so hard to describe using dualistic language what non-duality or non-dual actually is. But when it gets complex, it's just all is one, all not two, not separated, not this or that, not relative and absolute, not something and nothing. You see, these are all the kind of contradictory statements you hear. You can't describe non-dual, but it's obvious, and it's not polarized. It's not one thing resisting something else. But once that's clear, it's so simple. It's so simple. It's not heavy. It's not serious. It's not something you need to do. It's not awake and not awake. It's not I had awakening and now I'm super enlightened and you still experience negative emotions, still have arguments with your family, still experience pain, still have problems. Like, none of that goes away. It's not about that. It's not about not having, it's not about some idealistic idea about what enlightenment is and awakening is. Like, that's what led me down the nightmare road for such a long time, because I was chasing an ideal. I was chasing something that's not this, it's better than this. An experience is better than this. An ideal that's better than what this is right now. It's just so simple. And it becomes more about really giving yourself to immersing yourself in whatever appears in this life. It doesn't mean you can't act like an idiot, have a laugh, be silly, be stupid. I mean, life is silly enough. Like, I mean, it doesn't have to be so serious. Life is bizarre enough. Life is strange enough. You know, that the seriousness of it is a lot of the times dysfunctional. But I noticed there was also a addiction to, or a kind of, I guess you could say, masochistic enjoyment of the suffering. And when the suffering, there was almost for a while a romanticized idea of the suffering, like it was like an ex that you loved, but it wasn't right because it was too dysfunctional. There's that sense to it, and there's that story, that heaviness. Something was enjoying that to a degree. There was some enticement in there, and it all moved through and worked out the way it did. And it's fine, but there was a movement towards that suffering. That I'm not saying it was a choice. It appeared as a series of choices at the time, but there was an addiction to that, the suffering. There was a fascination with the pain, fascination with the idea of death, in a strange way. Anyway, I'm gonna have to go now, but it's a long video, and I'll talk to you next time.